3 pieces of timber, that's what stood between her and the dark that year. She'd inherited heartbreak with her quarter section of rocky land when her husband died. What was supposed to be their fresh start, that dream so many carried westward, had curdled into something closer to a tomb. For 12 months, she'd watched the seasons turn, watched her son grow skinnier, and watched her savings shrink in a way that felt inevitable, like gravity working on everything she tried to build. But worse than the poverty was what she decided: nobody needed to know about it. Pride, that particular variety of pride that masquerades as dignity, kept her lips sealed. She'd smile at the few neighbors who passed by. She'd nod like everything was manageable. She'd constructed an elaborate fiction around herself, and she guarded it the way some people guard gold. To ask for help felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. It felt like admitting failure, like proving wrong everyone who doubted she could make it out here alone. Then the blizzard didn't knock. It just arrived, sudden and absolute, like a door slamming shut on the world. Within 48 hours, she'd burned through her remaining wood supply and half of a hand-carved chair that had been her mother's. She still had her son, Toby, 6 years old, who'd never known a world that wasn't struggling, wrapped against her in the one bed that still held any warmth. And as the cold deepened past the point of physical comfort into something that belonged to nightmares, she found herself doing the mathematics that every frontier widow eventually confronted in the dark. How many days? How much longer could the two of them endure? And the terrible arithmetic that followed. Who would survive longer if one of them had to? That's when the man who saved her life appeared, not because he was heroic, but because he paid attention to something small enough that most people would have missed it. Daniel Tabor lived on the adjacent property, a man whose own loss had made him attentive to the losses of others. His wife had been gone for nearly 2 years, and in that time, grief had become less like a visitor and more like a permanent roommate who'd rearranged all his furniture. One thing he developed, a habit born from loneliness and the weight of managing a household that no longer felt like a home, was looking. Every cold morning, he'd scan the neighboring ridgelines, tracking which chimneys were breathing smoke and which weren't. It was a small ritual, the kind of observation that only mattered if catastrophe was already in motion. On the 3rd day of the blizzard, he noticed that Susanna's chimney had stopped exhaling. Not unusual on its own, but combined with his knowledge of her circumstances, knowledge he'd gleaned not from gossip, but from the kind of careful noticing that grief teaches you, something turned in his stomach. The snow had piled 4 feet deep by then. The distance between the two properties, normally a reasonable ride, had become an expedition. But he understood, in the way only a widower could, that a silent chimney in a blizzard was a language, and it was saying something urgent. He saddled his horse anyway. The journey took him an hour to cover what should have been minutes. The snow met the animal's chest. The wind held back against forward progress like a living thing. But Daniel pushed through because he'd already lost one person he might have saved, and he'd made himself a promise that he wouldn't develop that particular flavor of regret twice. When he reached the cabin, he had to use his shoulder against the door because the frame had frozen shut. What he found inside was a preview of a funeral he hadn't yet had to attend. Susanna and Toby were barely conscious, their lips colored the particular shade of blue that precedes the end. The fire had been dead for hours. The cabin's interior was colder than the wilderness outside. They were, by any honest measure, maybe 60 minutes away from becoming permanent fixtures of the landscape, like rocks worn smooth by time. Daniel didn't hesitate over what to do. He gathered every blanket he'd brought, folded them around both figures like a cocoon, and hauled them both, woman and child, up onto his horse. The ride back took longer going south because of the added weight, but he moved with the focused urgency of someone stopping a clock from completing its final tick. The doctor who visited the next day confirmed what Daniel already understood. Another night in that cabin, and there wouldn't have been any resurrection to describe. When Susanna woke, truly woke, past the fog of survival, she found herself in a warm bed in a warm house. Her son was breathing peacefully beside her, color returning to his cheeks like someone was painting him back into life. And there was a quiet man attending to the fire, the kind of man who seemed to belong to silence the way some people belong to crowds. She understood immediately what had happened. She'd been carried across the threshold between death and survival by someone whose kindness had asked nothing in return. And that's when something broke inside her, not in a destructive way, but in the way a dam breaks to release water that's been held too long. The shame came first, thick and suffocating. Shame that she'd let it get this far. Shame that pride had almost killed her son. Shame that a stranger had needed to rescue her from a situation she'd created through sheer stubborn refusal to reach out. The tears came with it, messy and years deep. Daniel, being the man he was, simply tended the fire and pretended he wasn't witnessing her unraveling. On the first day she could stand without her knees betraying her, Susanna announced she was returning to the cabin. Pure stubbornness, or what remained of it, had her reaching for her coat. She had her dignity to preserve, or what was left of it, and accepting charity, even charity that had quite literally saved her life, felt like it demanded some kind of retaliation. She made it as far as the doorway before Daniel spoke. His voice was mild, measured, devoid of any judgment or frustration. He simply stated facts. The cabin had no wood. The roof was compromised, which meant it was actively trying to kill anyone inside it. The snow on the trail was still 4 feet deep and would remain so for weeks. If she needed to practice independence so badly, she was welcome to attempt it, but he wouldn't be allowing Toby to accompany her. The boy would stay by the fire. If her pride required martyrdom, that was a choice available to her, but not at the expense of her child's life. It was stated kindly. It was impossible to argue against. Susanna sat back down, beaten not by force but by the simple, undeniable weight of logic meeting reality. And this marked the beginning of something that would reshape her entire understanding of what it meant to survive. She was not accustomed to being cared for. It felt like wearing borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit her frame. Every hot meal came with an internal tremor of obligation. Every warm blanket carried the subtle pressure of debt. It took her nearly a month to stop flinching when Daniel came near, to stop interpreting kindness as another form of transaction she'd eventually need to repay. But slowly, without her deciding it, the walls began to shift. Susanna learned that some people give without keeping a ledger. It was a foreign concept, and she had to unlearn everything her circumstances had taught her. The talking, when it began, did so with the particular velocity of rumor in a small community where entertainment options were limited and winter was long. A widow, an unmarried man, his house, the entire season of snow. And most damningly, the two of them, alone with his children, while the social fabric that held civilization together was supposedly being shredded. Mrs. Wick became the first official carrier of this particular concern. She arrived at Daniel's door with the measured expression of someone performing a civic duty. Surely, she suggested, Susanna could be relocated to town. Surely there was a corner somewhere, a spare room, any arrangement that would look less catastrophic to the community. The impropriety was concerning. The talk was already happening. The appearances were all wrong. What Daniel said in response became the sentence that folded the entire conflict into a shape it couldn't escape from. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform anger or defensiveness. He simply spoke with the authority of someone stating what he'd directly witnessed versus what others had merely speculated about. He'd pulled a woman and her son from what would have been their grave 3 days prior. Both of them existed in the present tense because of his decision to check a chimney instead of look away. The neighbors, the good Christian neighbors who were now so deeply invested in propriety, hadn't bothered checking at all. Nobody in those hills had, except the one man willing to look. Susanna had nothing. No resources, no shelter, no margin for error. She was staying in his house until spring because it was warm and because no place else would keep her and her son alive. He didn't care about the talking. In fact, he invited Mrs. Wick to carry his message back to Coldwater verbatim. He would sooner be the subject of gossip than be the kind of man who'd let a widow freeze to death to preserve his reputation. A person willing to exchange a child's death for social standing, Daniel concluded, didn't have a reputation worth preserving anyway. Mrs. Wick left, and she did deliver the message word for word, and the community talked, as communities do. But Daniel went about his day with the kind of peaceful indifference that only comes from moral certainty. What Susanna brought into that house wasn't gratitude, though she felt it. It wasn't compliance or meek acceptance of charity. She brought her hands. She brought her particular genius. Susanna Dyer was a quilter, not a competent one, but a true one. The kind that appears rarely, like comets. She could take fabric that had been deemed worthless, worn thin, faded, full of holes, and transform it into something that arrested people mid-motion. They'd enter a room where one of her quilts lay, and they'd simply stop, drawn to its beauty in a way they couldn't articulate. Daniel's house had become what grief makes of houses, a structure that was warm in temperature but cold in every other way that mattered. His 2 children, Pete, 9 years old and gone silent in the way children go silent when their foundation has crumbled, and Nan, 6, who cried through the nights, inhabited the space like ghosts. The absence of their mother had metastasized into the walls. It lived in the silence. It lived in the things nobody said. Susanna couldn't resurrect their mother. That wasn't within anyone's power, and she was wise enough not to attempt it. But she understood something fundamental about how to take what was broken and reassemble it into something that held warmth. She set up her quilting frame near the fire and worked through the winter. The quilts she made for the children came first. Quilts made to be slept under, to be held close in the way children hold close to things when they're afraid. But the moment that changed everything came in the deep cold of January when Susanna, searching through the house for scrap material, discovered a trunk in the loft. Mary's things, everything Daniel hadn't been able to touch in nearly 2 years. Her everyday dress, the green one with the small pattern. Her Sunday dress, the blue she'd been buried in 1,000 times over in his imagination. Her shawl, her cloak, all of it folded and hidden away in darkness because Daniel lacked the capacity to either use these items or release them. Susanna understood what she was looking at. She'd felt the weight of objects that carried someone's presence. She'd lived with that particular paralysis. She asked Daniel's permission gently, and he gave it, not quite understanding what she intended until he couldn't avoid understanding it anymore. Susanna dismantled Mary's dresses. She cut apart the blue, the green, the shawl. Across weeks, she pieced them into 2 new quilts, one for Pete, one for Nan, so that the motherless children could sleep under their mother's very fabric, could wake in darkness and feel the weight of cloth their mother had worn, could carry their dead with them into sleep every night of their lives. When she presented them, when she placed them into the arms of the hard, quiet boy and the crying girl, something broke open in that house. Pete, who hadn't allowed himself to cry since the funeral, wept. He put his face into the quilt made from his mother's things, and he sobbed like his body was cracking apart. Nan, who had developed a nightly ritual of grief, stopped crying in the dark after that night. Her mother was over her while she slept. She was woven in. She was present in the only form available. Daniel walked out to the barn and didn't return for hours. When he did, something had shifted in his capacity to speak about what had happened. He found Susanna by the fire and tried to articulate something that existed beyond language. What she'd done, what she'd given his children, was a form of grace he hadn't known existed. For 2 years, he'd preserved Mary's absence by keeping her things locked in the dark. It had been the only way he knew how to mourn, but Susanna had taken that locked thing and transformed it. She'd cut into grief itself and made it into something his children could wear, could sleep under, could carry forward. He didn't have words sufficient to contain what he felt, so he simply told her, "You made my children warm in a way I didn't know how to do." Susanna, understanding grief from her own deep knowledge of it, simply said that scraps people can't bear to look at are still warm if someone with love enough to do the difficult cutting is willing to attempt it. She gestured toward the space where they sat, and they grieved together, 2 people who understood the weight of loss, sharing the same fire, which is a form of tenderness deeper than most courtships ever achieve. The snow continued. The cold deepened. But inside the house, something had been reorganized at its foundation. 5 people who hadn't quite been a family began to operate as one, not through any formal decision-making process, but through the simple mathematics of proximity and shared warmth. The children stopped being shadows moving through a house haunted by absence. They became louder, messier, more alive. Nan followed Susanna like a duckling, learning how to set tiny stitches, how to choose colors that sang together, how to understand fabric the way some people understand music. Pete, the quiet boy who'd retreated into silence after his mother's death, began to open like a flower, getting deliberate care, not through direct questioning or forced conversation, but through being needed. Susanna needed wood split. She needed things reached from high shelves. She needed someone to admire the quilts she created, to witness her work and validate it, and Pete, by degrees, began talking again. Gruff at first, short words and observations, but by candlelight he was nearly chatty, pleased by the simple fact of being required. Toby and Nan created their own small civilization within the larger family structure, running through the house like a pair of wild things, with Pete self-appointed as their captain and protector. And Daniel, coming in from the stock on winter evenings, would pause in his own doorway like he'd walked into the wrong house, a better one than the one he'd left in the morning. And he'd have to consciously remind himself that this warmth, this noise, this evidence of life was temporary. Just until the thaw, he told himself. Just for this winter. He told himself this with decreasing conviction as the weeks accumulated. By the fire in the evenings, after the children had gone to sleep, Susanna told Daniel her own story, the parts she hadn't shared with anyone. Her husband, who had been decent and hopeful and who had worked himself into an early grave chasing a dream that the land had no interest in making real for him. The autumn of pretending month after month that everything was manageable, that she wasn't struggling, that asking for help wouldn't somehow invalidate everything she was attempting to do. Daniel understood this kind of pride. He had a considerable supply of his own. They developed a quiet habit. After the household went to sleep, they'd sit across the fire from each other, and Daniel would drink his coffee slowly, and they would talk about weather and stock and children and carefully about the dead. They spoke about grief with the authority of people who'd lived inside it long enough to understand its seasons. And beneath the conversations, something was banking itself down like coals, not yet flame, but fire waiting for oxygen. Neither of them named it. Partly because grief has its own protocol about such things, its own etiquette about moving too quickly into new emotions. But partly because to name what was happening would require reckoning with the thaw, with the dissolution of the snow that had locked them all together, with the terrible question of what happened when Susanna was no longer trapped there by circumstance. So they didn't name it, they simply let it gather in the space between them, growing warmer and more undeniable with each passing week. By the time the roads became passable again, Susanna's quilts had become something more than functional. They'd become wonder. The doctor's wife saw one of the children's quilts and experienced something close to spiritual conversion. She needed to commission one, then half the county needed one. Then people were waiting months, paying premium prices for the honor of sleeping under Susanna's work. The scandalous widow suddenly transformed into Susanna Dyer, the artist whose quilts were spoken of with reverence. She had her own money again. She had a name that meant something other than failure. She had options that hadn't existed 6 months prior. But Obadiah Stiles was not interested in allowing the narrative to shift so easily. Stiles held himself as deacon and community guardian, a tall man whose righteousness was so complete that he'd somehow confused his own disapproval with divine judgment. He'd decided that the Tabor household represented an ongoing scandal, a standing sin against community morality that required correction. The facts didn't trouble him. A woman had nearly frozen to death, and Stiles found the heroics tedious, mere sentiment. A grieving man had opened his fire to prevent a death, and Stiles found this irrelevant. What troubled him was the abstraction. An unmarried woman had lived in an unmarried man's house for an entire season. That was the architecture of sin, regardless of context. He moved to have the matter addressed formally. He called a meeting of the town's governing men and made his case with the cold certainty of someone who'd never experienced doubt. Susanna Dyer should be named in her sin and ejected from the county. Daniel Tabor should face censure before the church and community. The talk should be made official, formalized, properly sanctioned by authority. When Stiles finished speaking, Daniel stood. The room expected him to either defend himself with apologies or challenge with anger. Neither came. He simply described what had actually happened, with the specificity of someone who'd been present while others were speculating. On the third day of the blizzard, he discovered Susanna Dyer and her child in a state of profound hypothermia. They were by any reasonable assessment approaching death. They occupied a cabin that offered no shelter, contained no fuel, and had become actively dangerous. He'd brought them to his fire because the alternative was explaining 2 graves to the community come spring. The next 5 months, Susanna had worked. She'd crafted quilts that were recognized throughout 3 counties as extraordinary. She'd taken his motherless children and reassembled them, given them something to carry their lost mother into the future. She'd made a house that had died with his wife into a place where life was actually happening again. If Stiles wanted to name this sinful, Daniel said, then the community should be clear about what sin looked like in its actual shape, not the abstraction Stiles preferred, but the honest arithmetic. A woman and child saved from death, orphaned children reassembled and warmed, a house brought back from the dead. Then Daniel made the statement that would define the entire conflict and its aftermath. A man who'd allow a widow and her child to freeze to death for the preservation of his reputation has no reputation worth preserving. He'd meant this when he'd said it to Mrs. Wick in December. He meant it now. If Stiles wanted to censure him for that choice, Daniel would accept it gladly and count it cheap. Then Susanna stood. The room had not expected her. They'd expected her to remain quiet, or to defend herself with the meekness that propriety suggested was appropriate for a woman in her situation. Instead, she spoke with a clarity that cut through all the abstraction. She would be dead, she and her son both buried under snow in those hills, undiscovered until the thaw revealed corpses. Not a soul in the county would have known or cared, except Daniel Tabor, who was the only person willing to pay attention to the absence of smoke from a chimney. Stiles worried about how Daniel's choice to save them appeared. Susanna described what being saved actually felt like. She'd woken in a warm bed with her child alive beside her, and her first fully conscious thought was gratitude so profound it had cracked her open. That was what his actions had appeared like to her. They'd appeared like Christianity. They'd appeared like the actual embodied practice of the faith that everyone in Coldwater claimed to believe in. Stiles preferred the appearance of propriety to the appearance of a living child. He was welcome to that preference, but he should be clear about what he was choosing. The vote didn't go Stiles's way. The community, having heard the actual circumstances rather than Stiles's abstracted version of them, made a decision that revealed something about what people are capable of when they stop listening to the shape of moral theory and start looking at the shape of human suffering. They didn't vote Susanna out. They didn't vote Stiles' way at all. In fact, as the faces around the room shifted from support to recognition to something closer to shame, Obadiah Stiles watched his standing curdle in real time. He'd walked into that meeting expecting to cleanse the community of scandal. Instead, he'd provided the opportunity for the community to see itself clearly, to see the cold heart underneath the pious language. He left smaller than he'd arrived, and he remained small, because communities have a long memory for coldness once they've seen it clearly. When the snow began to recede and the roads became genuinely passable, Daniel waited. He'd been deliberate about this throughout the winter. He'd waited to pursue anything beyond conversation because he wouldn't have Susanna trapped by circumstance into any decision. He wanted her to choose freely, with every option genuinely available. Once the world had opened again, once she could actually leave, could return to the cabin if she chose, could relocate to town or join any of the 3 counties clamoring for her quilts, then he'd ask. He chose a morning when the snow was going off the hills, when the world was actively shifting towards something new. He didn't lead with emotion or poetry. He led with honesty. He told her what he'd meant when he'd said to Mrs. Wick in December, and what he'd meant when he'd said it to the church. That he didn't care about community judgment. That he'd meant it more intensely every week he'd known her. But he'd waited to make his actual request because the snow had imprisoned them both in proximity, and he wouldn't ask anything while she felt obligated by circumstance. He waited for the roads to open, for her to genuinely be able to leave before asking her to stay. He wasn't asking because proximity had made it convenient. He was asking because she'd walked into a house that had been dead in every way that mattered, and she'd made it warm through her presence and her work and her willingness to cut into her own grief to honor his. He couldn't imagine going back to the cold. He didn't want to learn how. He asked if she would marry him, not for the room by the fire. She'd earned her own fire now, her own income, her own restored name. She didn't need his roof or his shelter or his protection. He was asking because he wanted the fire to be hers by right and not by rescue, because his children had taken to praying for it. Because somewhere underneath all those quilts she'd made, he'd stopped being able to picture his own life without her in it. And he still didn't care who talked, though now he wouldn't mind if the talk centered on a wedding. Susanna, who had lain in a frozen cabin certain she and her son would die unnoticed and unmissed, looked at the man who'd come through 4 feet of snow because her chimney had stopped smoking. She thought about what he'd done, systematically and without expectation of thanks. She thought about how he'd let her cut his dead wife's dresses to warm his living children, which required a level of trust that only occurred between people who truly understood grief. She'd been warm since the day he'd given her permission to do that cutting. Warm in a way that went deeper than fire or blankets. She took his hands and said yes. They married in the spring, and the county came to the wedding despite Stiles' absence. The talk shifted, as talk does, from scandal to something closer to satisfaction. A widow and a widower, a woman and a man who'd both understood the shape of loss deeply enough to recognize it in each other. Susanna's quilts grew famous across multiple counties. Nan apprenticed at her frame as she grew older, learning the intricacies of color and pattern and structure. The first quilt Susanna had ever created in that house, not one reconstructed from Mary's dresses, but a new one made from her own scraps, remained on the foot of their bed throughout her life. It served as a reminder. She'd lived long enough to see that the warmest things humans create are often constructed from materials that somebody else had deemed worthless. Worn fabric, discarded cloth, pieces that didn't fit together by any logic except the logic of someone patient enough to understand their value. Pete and Nan grew up sleeping under their mother's colors, understanding viscerally that they'd had 2 mothers, one who gave them their first breath, and one who refused to let them sleep cold or grieve alone. Daniel lived out a long life by that fire, a fire he never once regretted sharing. He told anyone who would listen that the best decision he'd ever made was moving toward the silent chimney instead of away from it. He'd ridden through a blizzard because he'd paid attention to something small enough that most people would have missed. That attention had changed everything, and Susanna lived as a woman who'd been carried out of the cold into a warmth that never left her. Not the kind that burns on wood, but the kind that burns in the place where grief transforms into purpose, where isolation transforms into family, where the act of looking closely at another person's suffering becomes the exact same action as saving their life. That's the story of Susanna Dyer, a woman who lay down to freeze with her son and was carried out of the cold by a man who told the entire community he had room by his fire, and meant it absolutely, and who discovered by that fire a warmth sufficient to sustain her for all of her remaining days. The real magic wasn't that he had wood to burn or fire to share. Every community has people with resources. The magic was that he looked when everybody else looked away. He paid attention. He saw the absence of smoke as a crisis rather than as something happening to someone else. That's what separates the stories we tell about heroism from the actual heroic act. It's not the grand gesture made with an audience. It's the small attention paid when no one's watching. It's the decision to move towards suffering instead of past it. If you've ever been cold in a way that wasn't about temperature, you understand this story. If you've ever been isolated not by distance but by pride. If you've ever experienced the terrifying arithmetic of calculating how long you could last with what you had. If you've ever discovered that the people who save us sometimes ask nothing in return, and that maybe that's the truest definition of love. That fire's still burning in people everywhere. It's burning in the stranger who notices your struggle when everyone else is performing not to see. It's burning in the person willing to cut into their own pain to honor yours. It's burning in every community that, given the choice between judgment and actual human connection, chooses the harder, better thing. Keep looking for that fire. And when you find someone cold, move toward them instead of away. That's the whole story.